Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Brekke, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on what to do about hedge funds in journalism. And just to be clear at the top, this event is also a fundraiser for Rick Goldsmith's documentary, Stripped for Parts, the story of one secretive hedge fund that has plundered what is left of America's newspapers and about the journalists who are fighting back. Now, we're going to hear from Rick, and at some point, I can promise you he's going to ask you very nicely for your help. We're also going to hear from several journalists who have thought hard about the question, what to do about hedge funds in journalism. First, we have Julie Reynolds. She's an investigative reporter whose one-time employer, the Monterey Herald here in California, was acquired by the hedge fund Alden Global Capital. That was a little more than a decade ago. As Alden cut staff at the paper, Julie took a voluntary layoff to help save a colleague's job. That was not a good day for the hedge fund's owners. Since then, she's focused her investigative skills on Alden and its owners, working to uncover exactly what the hedge fund is doing with the millions of dollars it's sucking out of its newspapers. Julie is also a founding editor of Voices of Monterey Bay. That's an independent nonprofit news site that she describes as a kind of mini New Yorker for the Monterey Bay Area, but bilingual, bicultural, and more grassroots and irreverent. Chuck Plunkett is director of CU News Corps, part of the journalism program at the University of Colorado Boulder. Before that, he worked for 15 years at the Denver Post, first as political editor and later as editorial page editor. He had a front row seat to the destruction of the Post at the hands of Alden Global Capital. Chuck decided to do something about what Alden was doing, leading a team of Post writers who called out Alden for its business practices and writing an editorial laying out for Denver and the world at large just what was at stake. The paper was dismantled. We're also joined by Robert McChesney. He's written numerous books on journalism and media. Along with John Nichols, Robert was awarded the U.S. Newspaper Guild's 2010 Herbert Bloch Freedom Award. According to the Guild's Executive Council, the two of you have done more for press freedom than anyone. Your body of work is second to none. This is a transformative year for journalism. If we are able to chart a course that will preserve what matters, it will be in large part due to both of you. Robert has been writing most recently about a national initiative to save and grow local journalism. And finally, Rick Goldsmith. Rick and I got to know each other back in the 1980s as softball teammates in our adopted hometown of Berkeley. And, softball serious business here. Eventually, we started talking about journalism. I was an editor with the old San Francisco Examiner, and Rick was working on a film about the pioneering investigative reporter and press critic, George Seldes. That documentary, Tell the Truth and Run, George Seldes and the American Press, was nominated for an Oscar. He got a second nomination in 2010 for his film with co-director Judith Ehrlich, The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. Rick's current project, Stripped for Parts, looks at the systematic destruction of newspapers by Alden Global Capital, but also considers what hedge fund ownership means to the survival of democracy in the United States. And Rick, here we are after all these years. I'm still in a newsroom and you're still making documentaries, and I'm turning the mic over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Great introductions. I want to set the stage of what this film is about, or how I got into it, really. In the spring of 2012, the events that Dan talked about that Chuck Plunkett kind of set in motion became national news. And here were these journalists rising up against the hedge fund owner. And it was like, what? I mean, journalists, they write about other people's issues. Now they are the story. What's going on here? So they were going to battle to stop the hedge fund from plundering, and also educating the public to what was going on in journalism. I felt like I just had to get into this story, and I hadn't done a film on journalism in close to a decade. So this is going to be my, I guess, the third of my trilogy on films about journalism. But the story actually began several years later. The story actually began several years earlier, and we're going to show a clip here. And here you meet Julie Reynolds, who was working at this small paper on the Northern California coast, the Monterey County Herald.
We got bought in late 2011 or 2012 by this mysterious company. Nobody even knew who they were. And somebody dug up the name. It was called Alden Global Capital, and it was a New York hedge fund. Everything was downsized. We had layoffs pretty much every 6 months. We had to move into a smaller space. The printing plant was shut down. All our stories were being copy edited 300 miles away where no one knew how to spell the name of the city council person in the story. I heard that the News Guild, which was my former union when I worked at the Monterey Herald, was looking for somebody to write some stories and edit a website. I said, "You're an investigative reporter. Why don't you dig into Alden and just write about who they are and what they're doing, because people don't know."
Julie, thanks for being on the panel.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right. So after the Alden took over your paper, things got so bad that you took a buyout. And then later, you were working as a freelancer and in cooperation with the News Guild, your former union, you started to investigate. What did you discover about this company that had decimated your former newspaper?
Well, at the time that they took over our paper, nobody had heard of Alden Global Capital. They were not among these hedge funds you saw news stories about all the time. And if you did, there was pretty little mention in the financial press about any of their background or history. Once I started looking at them, it was stunning that how hard it was to find information about them. Their website claimed they had offices all over the world, in Mumbai and Dubai, London. And they seemed like this huge multinational corporation, but it turned out I found no evidence that most of those offices ever existed and were not still open. I did find numerous funds set up in the Cayman Islands, which always raises questions about a company's intentions. They were originally incorporated in the Isle of Jersey, which is another tax secrecy haven similar to the Caymans. And so here's this company that's getting into the news business, but it's shrouded in secrecy. It was a very small company, just 2 people founded it, Heath Freeman and Randall Smith. And they were known as the vulture capitalists. They were known as people who looked at distressed businesses, took them over, sucked whatever was left of the remains, and then discarded the bones in the desert. That just was a really ominous foreshadowing of, like, if these people are taking over newspapers, what is that going to mean to our access to information in this country? It was rather startling, I would say. And that was just on the first go through digging up information about them.
Well, what you're describing right now seems like it's almost common knowledge to people who follow the newspaper story. But back then, as you said, nobody knew anything about them. What was it that you thought was important? It seems so obvious now. Yeah, you get an investigation and then all this stuff comes to light, but you were kind of pioneering this stuff. And what was obvious to you that this needed to be investigated, that they needed to be investigated, and that maybe something important was going to come out of it?
Well, I think to me, what really drove me was the whole myth of what is killing local news. Was broken apart once I looked at what Alden was really doing and why they were doing it. Like a lot of people, I had thought, local newspapers were dying because the internet came along. Newspaper companies were dinosaurs. They didn't know how to modernize and digitize. They weren't getting with the new generation. They were just old dinosaurs ready to fade away. But it turns out, that there was an actual deliberate effort to shut down these papers. And it had nothing to do with shutting down journalism. These owners and investors don't care about journalism one way or the other. They're not there to influence our reporting. They were just there to suck money out of newspapers. and leave them to dry. They treated it like any other business. Alden has a history of going into shoe store chains, into pharmacy chains, all kinds of industries, and taking what's left and just leaving the businesses dead on the side of the road. So it's pretty startling to see this was happening to newspapers, and it shocked me. And then I started talking to other people about it and realizing, wow, we're all believing this myth that, Craigslist took all our classified advertising. It killed the newspaper. The internet killed the newspaper. When actually there was a whole other series of things going on, and very deliberate, in order to extract cash from newspaper chains and leave them just to flounder.
And how extensive was this? I mean, you talked about it happened to your paper, the Monterey County Herald. But how extensive was it? Was it predominant in your newspaper? Was it national? Give us an idea of what the scope.
It was national. I mean, at the time, Digital First Media, in terms of circulation, was the second largest chain in the country. And I started finding out that all the other papers in the chain were experiencing the same thing we were. Their buildings
and just to be clear, Digital First Media was the name of the newspaper chain that Alden owned.
Yes,
yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, across the board, their buildings were being sold, printing presses dismantled, staff being laid off. I eventually calculated twice the national rate of other news chains. It was pretty shocking to see the real estate being siphoned off into a side corporation, an LLC that Alden set up. And I start seeing all of our newspaper buildings for sale on this website online. And I'm like, they've got a whole industry set up to just dismantle our papers, take the buildings, take the assets. And it was very frightening. Losing your building is that's the safety net a small town paper has, to weather hard times. That's their equity. That's what they can fall back on. And we all lost that at the same time all across the country. So it's pretty startling to see the systematic shutdown of these community institutions.
Yeah. So who was reading these articles that you wrote? And did you have, what was the sense? Did you feel like you were making an impact?
I got hired to run a little union website just so that the members could communicate with each other. And we ended up just using that as a platform to put these stories and these investigations out there. So basically, in the beginning, hardly anybody read them. And it wasn't until I think when I went to a journalism conference in Berkeley, the Logan Symposium, and I met an editor at The Nation and told him this story of how our newspapers were being intentionally dismantled. And he was shocked. And I go, wow, if The Nation doesn't even know about this, I guess a lot of people don't know about this. We need to get this word out there. And I did a cover story for The Nation, and I think that really started to set the stage and get the paradigm shift changed to like you say, now today, people know that hedge funds are doing this to local news.
Yeah. I'm also interested, give us a sense of of the onion that was peeled. Because it seemed like it was like, when I go over your articles and read them from the first one through, you've written over 100 articles now.
Yep.
It builds. There's something new in every article. So give us a sense both of what you had to do to dig that out and how it did build. What was the onion like for you?
Well, it was such a unique thing because I've had the strangest and most wonderful job in journalism as an investigative reporter, because I've looked at one corporation for 6 years now. That's, usually you got, if you're lucky, if you got 2 weeks to do a story, so this was astounding. And there's something, and I had learned this in our small town paper, there's something about being on a beat where you can just chip away and look at this. You don't have a big blockbuster. You're just looking at this angle leads to that angle leads to this one. And especially with these Byzantine, labyrinthine corporations with dozens and dozens of LLCs incorporated offshore, you do need to just chip away because you're going to find different things all the time. I find this pattern overall. I'm still discovering new things. I've all been skirting the edge of the law in numerous lawsuits in numerous jurisdictions where they always push it right to the edge of legality and end up getting charged, or sued, settling out of court, somehow, being able to dust themselves off and move on every time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I found it fascinating to discover one by one all the things that they did, all these scurrilous things. And when you dig into the history of Randall Smith, who started it, and then Heath Freeman, who then became the president, he's more active now. It's just amazing to see the extent of, from the real estate scams to pushing around these other hedge funds themselves and getting sued, to closing newsrooms, to doing all these things. I want to give people a sense of the time frame. So you started getting into this, what was it, the end of 2015, right?
January 2016.
Yeah, January 2016, and that the article, the meeting with the guy from The Nation, that was maybe a year and a half later in 2017. And when I heard about the story, it was 2018. So I'm going to leave you right here. Julie's going to be back to talk with us later, but I want to bring in Chuck Plunkett. And first, I'm going to introduce Chuck by us showing another clip. Digital First Media, Alden's newspaper chain, was then about 100 newspapers nationwide. So the flagship paper was the Denver Post, and they had many, like many Alden-owned newspapers, had already had many layoffs. And one day in March of 2018, it was announced that 30 people, nearly a third of the newsroom, would lose their job. And that brings us to the next clip.
I had that thought that they just killed the Denver Post. And then I had this secondary thought, somebody should do something about this. And then I had the thought, well, the editorial page editor is the person that should do something about this. You should do something about this. You have a way to make it happen.
The Sunday editorial pullout section of the Denver Post was an act of defiance and desperation.
The Post's editorial board published a lead editorial headline as "Vultures Circle the Denver Post Must Be Saved."
These are people who give it everything they've got, and they're doing it for good reasons, and their work's not being valued, and it's being lost, and the community's losing something profoundly important.
Chuck, thank you for appearing with us. You're no stranger to being interviewed on camera because of what we just saw on that clip. So you wrote this editorial highly critical of the owners of your newspaper. You were putting your job and maybe your career at risk. What went into your decision to do that? That could not have been an easy decision, but somehow you felt it important. What went into that?
Yeah, well, thanks to reporting that Julie had done and that others started to pick up on, it became increasingly obvious to us at the Denver Post that our owners that had been in control of the company since the early days of 2011, last part of 2010, did not have our best interest at all at heart. What started as an effort by the company that we thought was well-intentioned to bring us into the 21st century, be digital first. That's why the parent company was named Digital First Media, was going to retool the newsroom to make sure that we used all the tools that the 21st century technology allows. And initially, some of the buyouts and the reductions of staff in the newsroom seemed to make a certain amount of sense. When I first started at the Post, it was in the glory days where we were closer to 300 folks in the newsroom. By this point, by going into 2012, when I was a new politics editor, we only had maybe about 175, 150, somewhere around in that range, which seemed a manageable. We could work with that. That was still a pretty large force. But then every spring, it seemed like, when they ran the numbers, profit was paramount for Alden. And it became clear that a lot of the visionaries at Digital First Media that had retooled us and retrained us had gone out the door, weren't satisfied with what was going on there. We started to hear a lot of rumbling. We started to hear a lot of criticism of the company, and we just started to see it for ourselves. The practices that were taking place at the Denver Post did not make journalistic sense. Things that were just routine, things that you always covered in a budget. If there was a flood, you made sure that your reporters in the field had hotel rooms to stay in while they were out far away from Denver covering the flood and things like that. Suddenly that got shrunk down and down and down. And then year after year, we kept cutting the newsroom by 15, 18, 20 some people. And then we come to that terrible day in March that you just mentioned in 2018, when we learned that our newsroom was going to go from 100 down to 70. And, you know, there was a lot of crying in the newsroom, and people were very upset. And as you saw from the clip, the realization that came to a lot of us was they just killed the Denver Post. We're never going to be able to get the brand back. We're never going to be able to have the kind of power and influence and that we had in the past as journalists. And so what went through my mind was the community is about to lose this organization, this mechanism that supports democracy and enables democracy and helps communities reach their full potential by keeping them informed and by holding the powerful accountable and giving a voice to the voiceless, was going to be so diminished that it was essentially going to be dead or on its way to death's door. And so what was going to be lost just seemed insurmountable and irreplaceable. And yet, as has been referred to already in this panel, the common man, the reading public didn't know this, didn't know why this was happening. They just thought, oh, it's just the internet. Oh, it's just Craigslist. They didn't realize that our own owners, by design, were bleeding the lifeblood out of the newsroom so that they could support just purely profit-seeking initiatives and endeavors. I'm all about making profit. I'm all about making money. I wish I had more money all the time. But if you own a newsroom, if you're responsible for a newsroom, you have a larger commitment, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of folks in journalism and public policy. And that commitment is that maybe you do take a lean year. Maybe you don't always make maximum profit. Maybe you skate by, but you make sure that the journalism is being delivered because it matters so much. It matters to your community. And once you see it like that, it's such a black and white, right and wrong kind of thing to consider, or question to consider. Does my job really matter at that point? A, do I really want to keep working for an owner that treats its newsrooms this way? And B, can I sit silently by and watch it happen when I know that it's possible that I could sound the alarm and at least let the people know, let the public know that this was going on and why it was going on? And I was lucky because I didn't have to look very far. I just had to look at Julie's reporting and plug some holes, and the editorial came together. And from that point on, there was no going back.
You really put your, I mean, I understand everything that you said. And I also am aware that there were 100 other newspapers that were suffering in the same way that the Denver Post was, that were owned by Alden Global Capital. But you were the one person who wrote about it. I mean, newspaper people are known for writing about other people's issues and not about their own, number one. And then to put your job at risk, your former editor saw your copy before you published it, and he says, you know, you're a dead man. So what happened?
You know, you're right. When the whole time I was in the newsroom, I didn't really want to think that much about the owners. I didn't want to think about the business side of it. And I don't even really care if that sounds that naive. I cared about the journalism. I cared about what we were covering. I figured the money side was being taken care of by the smart money people. And I didn't want to get enmeshed in this. People were talking about the kind of stuff Julie was writing about long before I started to take keen interest. I was so focused on at first being the politics editor and then getting what I considered a real dream job, being the editorial page editor, that I just wanted to focus on that. And we even pretty much kind of had an understanding that we didn't write about ourselves. We didn't make ourselves the center of attention. We didn't participate in protest and those kinds of things. So what got me was my position on the editorial board, because it got me more access to people like a Dean Singleton, who had been the former owner or the former publisher of the Denver Post and the controller of Digital First Media, that huge chain that Julia was referring to. And he was so disgusted by what Alden was doing, and he was so adamant about that this was no way to run a newsroom. And when we would sit and talk about the value that a newsroom gave to a city like Denver or St. Paul or Monterey and the other papers across the country that you mentioned that Alden was destroying, we just kept saying this has to stop. The people have to know. We have to figure out how to do something. It wasn't just me. There was a whole lot of folks that wanted to sound the alarm, were looking for ways to try to get attention. It's just, as an editorial page editor with owners who weren't paying that much attention to what we were doing in the newsroom and what we were doing on the editorial page, I saw a way to publish and get away with it long enough that the public would find out. And once you're in that position and you know that it can happen, again, it just comes back to, it seems like a pretty simple question. It's a right and a wrong kind of an issue, and you want to be on the right side of those kinds of questions.
And tell the audience what did happen. I mean, did you get fired? Did you, what happened to you personally after the editorial was published?
Well, it wasn't pleasant. They didn't fire me right away. There was a desire to, immediately after the publication. The idea was to strip all the columns and the editorial that we put together off the internet, to strip what was going into production at the printing plant, the Sunday Perspective section that had the special edition with the editorial that called out Alden and called them vulture capitalists and exposed them to our readers for the first time. They were going to destroy that so that couldn't be put in the paper. But folks in the newsroom, top-level editors in the newsroom, convinced the owners or convinced the management, you can't take something off the internet. Attention, Digital First Media, you can't take something off the internet. It's already out there. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. All over the country, journalists have already made copies of it. For one thing, you're not going to be able to hide it. And if you fire him right away, it's gonna back up the central argument of what he was saying, which is you don't care about journalism. You can't stand up to this kind of criticism. Likewise with the print edition. So they rolled the dice and decided to let the articles remain online, to let the section publish. It was kind of how we hoped it would go, that facing the worst public reaction, backlash, that they would just allow what we had done to go ahead and seep out and to run its course. But then I can tell you the weeks following that, it was hell being in that editorial position. They wanted to screen, all my copy had to be submitted. First they asked that anything that was going to be published in the opinion pages be submitted to a panel that they controlled to review it ahead of time. I think it was 3 business days. Even if it was 2 business days, that's ridiculous in a newspaper. There's no way you can have that much headway or heads up time and expect to have any kind of a cutting edge product. So that kind of fell through, but that showed you the level of desire that they had to try to coerce and prevent further discussion along these lines, to discussions about taking me off the editorial page and putting me back in the newsroom in a role that wouldn't have the ability to write about Alden in any way, and those kinds of moves. And it was clear that I was no longer going to be welcome there. It was clear that my career had already ended, and so I was already thinking in terms of resigning. But I did see one more opportunity, Rick, and that was about a month later. We found out that there had been these communications from some of the folks in Digital First Media that were responsible to the Alden, to Heath Freeman and so forth, pretty much forbidding discussion about this and forbidding people from putting more information about what was going on at Alden controlled papers in Alden controlled papers, which isn't, to me, struck me as an act of censorship and wrong. And so I tried to write an editorial to run through the screeners, the media minders that I now had, that said, you know, a month after being called out for trying to destroy its newsroom, instead of trying to listen and reform and take the more honorable move and restore the trust in the newsroom and the funding in the newsroom, at least moderately to meet the need, they're just trying to shoot the messenger. They're just trying to kill the messenger. And of course, that editorial wasn't going to get to see the light of day. And once I had that officially, and I decided that was the goodest time at any to wrap it up, that I had done my best and couldn't do any better. And it would be time to look for some other employment.
Well, so you resigned at that point because of the censorship. Well, and what people should know is that Chuck's editorial in that whole section that he oversaw went viral, and it was on the front page of newspapers and the lead story of news reports, broadcast news reports all over the country. We're going to bring Chuck back a little bit later in this panel discussion. Thanks for sharing that with us, Chuck, and we'll get more from you later. And right now, I'm going to bring Dan on, and he magically appears. So I'll toss it over to you, Dan. Thanks, Chuck.
Well, you know, that's a pretty hard story to follow. You know, one thing that we wanted to talk about here was the process of making the film. I just want to say about Chuck's story, you know, that is a really, that's a tough road that he walked there, and it's inspiring. It's really inspiring to hear. Rick, you know, we're going to talk about where you are in the film, and you know, I've known you for a long time, and I know the kind of filmmaking you do is really a long, arduous process. Your life gets split up into planning and logistics and shooting and post-production and fundraising, what we're doing today, and in addition to other things in your life, like your family. And this film is no different from what you've done before in that sense. It's been years in the making, and you've been all over the country to interview people. Tell us where you are in the process now, and funding-wise, what do you need now to close the deal?
So I cut out there for a second here, but I think I'm back.
Oh, you are?
I am.
Well, I was
Okay.
just asking where you are in the process
Yeah.
of making this film. You know, there is a heartfelt toss to you, and I'm really disappointed that you missed it. So where are you in the film, and what do you need in terms of fundraising to close the deal?
Well, we're quite far along in production. We've got about 80% of our shooting is complete. Early on, we raised funding from contributions to cover all of that. Then the pandemic hit, which slowed us down in terms of what we could shoot, and also funding became more difficult as money was kind of tight everywhere. But things are opening up now. We're moving ahead production-wise, and we've devoted the month of April to raising at least $75,000. And we're well more, we've raised well more than half of that 70,000, but we need more. And what will these funds go towards? One, completing production, and then the bulk of it would go towards post-production, which means editing, graphic design, animation, writing script, sound design, music, that sort of thing. So we need your help. And you can do that now. Just hit the green button that says support the film. That allows you to contribute by PayPal, credit, or debit card. And you can also donate by sending us a check. So all the necessary info is there on our website. The website is Stripped for Parts Film, all one word, strippedforpartsfilm.com. So that takes care of that. We want this film to be the best it can be. Audiences nowadays for documentary film expect entertaining, compelling stories, well told, with high production values, which has always been my standard anyway. So this is my third documentary film with journalism as a central theme, as I think I said before. The first two were Academy Award nominated, and I expect the same quality and impact with this film, especially because the subject matter and the themes are so important. That is, the crisis in local journalism, and what are we doing about it? So that's my pitch. That's all I've got to say on that, Dan.
All right. And I think you said it well. And now it's time to hear from our next panelist. Rick, tell us about him.
Okay. Just 1 second here. Bob McChesney, he has been writing about journalism and democracy and the intertwining of the two for at least 2 decades, maybe more. So welcome, Bob, to our panel.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rick. It's really been an enlightening experience so far.
All right, great. So what I've got for you, whoops, I'm reading off of stuff that is for Chuck. Okay.
Well, I'll tell you, Rick, while you're looking at your notes, let me just say something. I think what you've heard Julie and Chuck and Dan all describing, but especially Julie and Chuck so far, has been the free fall, collapse, disintegration of local journalism in the U.S. At the hands of the hedge funds. And, one thing I know from my experiences, I deal with the crisis in journalism for a long time, and especially now, is that people all experience this. They all know it's happening, because they know there aren't any reporters in their town. A lot of times we didn't have anyone covering anything in them, especially compared to just 10, 20, 30 years ago, when it was dramatically different. But they don't really understand why that is. They don't understand if there's anything they can do about it. They just sort of accept it to the extent they even think about it, which is what makes your film so very important, because a great film, a great documentary can really crystallize what's going on and start explaining things and getting people interested and get active then. How can we affect this so we can actually have journalism again in our community? And the cost of your film is so absurdly low for the sort of a mountain you're climbing with it, that I hope people will just take whatever they give and make the donation, because you're going to get a multiplier effect of 1,000 to 1 with a film like this, especially with someone of your caliber making it.
Thank you for those kind words, Bob. Thank you. I want to ask you, you've written so much here. So the situation we have now, is there half as many paid journalists working than a decade ago? More than half the newspapers in this country are owned and controlled by hedge funds. There's an increase of news deserts and ghost newspapers every year. So help put this in perspective. What's the cost to all of us? What goes unreported when newsrooms of all these newspapers are hollowed out?
Well, I think that the research here is pretty emphatic and unequivocal. We have a situation where when you have less coverage of local politics and what's going on in governmental institutions, you see a huge increase in corruption. No one's watching people in power and their dealings with powerful people in their communities. It's unavoidable. Politicians, there's a lot of good money to be made if no one's paying any attention to what you're doing. And for people who want to control the government and bribe people and get their way with government, no journalism is a godsend for you too, because you can get away with this stuff. Yeah. But it goes beyond that. It's not simply a matter of governance, although that's a huge area. It's also just knitting communities together. Just the fact that knowing who your representatives, maybe if someone on 2 blocks away from you traveled somewhere, they knew a story about they came back because they were in Africa and reported on that. And you say, I didn't know that person did that. And he sort of knits people together and gives you a sense that, you're part of a community. And when you lose your local newspaper or don't have one to begin with, people feel a lot more like they're on their own on a raft out at sea. They're not really connected to their community. And I don't think there's any sociology ever that thinks that produces happy, healthy people or communities. So a healthy local news media is crucial to providing sort of the bond that keeps people together.
Very well said. There are many quote unquote solutions being discussed in the journalism world now, from digital startups to nonprofit and philanthropic models, like in Philadelphia, and now Baltimore is coming up with one like that. But you, in your writings, you're taking a much more comprehensive approach. You've written a local journal, you call it Local Journalism Initiative, which calls for, among other things, public funding of journalism. So talk to us, talk to the audience about that.
Well, let me just say that I don't think the hedge funds caused the crisis in journalism today. I think they are the last stage of the collapse of the commercial system. When they come in and buy up these newspapers, it's not like they're competing with all sorts of businesses and investors who are eager to invest in newsrooms. They're getting them at these discount prices to strip for parts because the people who own it want to jump ship because they realize they don't think they can make money doing it any longer. And so that's why it's important to understand we're at this final stage. We're seeing the disintegration of journalism. By my research, the daily newspapers, digital and traditional newsprint, they're getting less than 10% of the revenues that they used to get, factoring in per capita, than they were 2 generations ago, and maybe 15 or 20% of what was a generation ago. And the numbers are falling dramatically every year as a percentage of GDP. And as a result of that, it's not going to get any better. It's going to require an entirely new paradigm. But we've got to understand the situation before we go to the new paradigm. In my view, there's really no sense in trying to patch up a commercial system if it means you're just bailing out the hedge funds and paying for their workers for them, like they care, and giving them the power to control newsrooms. That's absurd. What we need to do is take public monies, put it in the hands of elected bodies, of nonprofit groups that compete for the money in elections, of people just like Julie Reynolds. There are lots of people around the country eager to do this. So they have the funds to pay themselves, to hire other people and cover their communities. And they don't have to worry about trying to shake down foundations or billionaires or go over and sell advertising. Just depend on the public money they win in a fair election. And if they do a good job, they'll win re-election with other groups. And if they fail, they'll be tossed out. But the power over the money will come from the voters in any given community. And I do it at the county-wide basis. We just have to have a new paradigm where we actually have competitive, independent local journalism. And the stuff we're talking about so far in this country is so wide of the market, at best it gets us back to like 2017 or something. And it just doesn't seem to be satisfactory. This film is so important because it chronicles just the collapse and disintegration of what's going on around us. It makes it so clear that this is not a tolerable situation. If you want to know why conspiracy theories are so prevalent, well, that's the main reason is that there's the reliable information that needs to bomb people to answer questions and deal with them isn't there anymore. And when that disappears, then anyone's theory on the internet is as good as anyone else, and anyone can say the most outrageous thing gets the most attention. We need local journalism. It's not an option, or our republic simply won't survive.
One of the things that jumps out at me from your initiative and your more comprehensive look at this is to remove the notion that somehow a business model is what's going to save us. I mean, we have public school teachers. They're not supposed to make money for us. We have the fire department. They're not supposed to make money for us. The police, even the defense budget, they're not supposed to make money. We decided that those things needed to be funded in some sort of way.
They're public goods. They're public goods. That means public goods. Society requires that the market can't produce in sufficient quality or quantity. So the public steps in. And what Rick, from talking to me before the show, is I've done a lot of my research on the history of American journalism. And the founders of this country were obsessed with having a vibrant and competitive, independent press system. But at no time in the first 100 years of American history would you hear anyone say, well, all we have to do to have a press system is just let rich people make as much money as possible, and then we're going to have great newspapers all over the place. That was an unthinkable idea in this country until late in the 19th century. And that's why we have the post office. Its entire job, why it's in the Constitution, was to distribute newspapers at a massive subsidy, 10% of the papers distributed for free. So it would encourage a broad range of newspapers, inexpensive, because they understood that the free press, journalism, wasn't sort of a fringe benefit you get in a free society. It was the oxygen and the glue that made that society possible. Jefferson famously said, if I had my choice of having newspapers or having the government, I'd always take newspapers, because unless you have newspapers, the government will be tyranny. If you have newspapers and a government, you can build a government out of the knowledge of the people. And they understood that it was mandatory to have. And that's the situation we're in now. Are we going to listen to the framers, look at what they did? And they said, we take this seriously. We're going to bankroll it. And what we learned from the framers also is when the government puts the money forward, if you frame the policy right, the government doesn't control who gets it. It wasn't like they picked out who got it and who didn't get it. If anything, they were the instances of post office censorship are so few, they're sort of legendary now. Like when Southern post offices would ban abolitionist papers in the South, which outraged people in the North. It was one of the key factors that led to Northern support to go to war.
Yeah. So what Bob was referring to was in 1790s, shortly after the revolution was done and George Washington, the Congress voted for this Post Office Act, which would basically support the transportation of newspapers through the mails. And that's how the post office grew, but that's also how everybody in the country, regardless of how rich or poor they were, was able to get these new things. Well,
I jumped on that.
Newspapers.
Let me add this to that. In the 19th century, first 100 years of American history, newspapers were all papers, dailies in cities were distributed by the post office. In a city like New York, they'd have delivery 2 or 3 times a day, 7 days a week. And 70% of the traffic of the post office was newspapers. Over 95% of the weighted traffic was newspapers. That's what the postmasters did. And actually, the research I did with some statisticians and economists and postal historians, we determined using government data that the value of the subsidies, the percentage of GDP, to subsidize below cost the distribution of newspapers. Today, if we had the same percentage of GDP doing that, we'd be spending $46 billion annually, the government. That's how serious they took this. The post office was the largest federal institution, except for the military during the Civil War, all the way up until the 20th century, by far. That was what made this country one country, and it was built around the press system, distributing newspapers.
Right. And then, in the mid 1800s, the newspapers figured out a way through advertising mostly.
That's right, and that's what changed everything.
To change everything, and that business model worked for 170 years until about the turn of the 21st century. And then
the advertising will never come back. The advertising will never come back because the advertisers never supported newspapers because they gave a damn about newspapers or journalism. They did it for some commercial reason. It's the best way to reach their target audience. Well, in the age of Google and Facebook and the internet, knowing everywhere you online at all times and everything about you, advertisers can go to those companies and say, track down the people who I want to reach, and they can find us wherever we are online. There's no reason to buy an ad on any site, generically, news or otherwise. So that whole model's blown up, and nothing will ever bring it back.
Right. The history of newspapers, the rise and fall, the good things, the wonderful things that came out of newspapers, the horrible things that came out of newspapers. It's a fascinating history, and we will actually be covering that in our film. We want to put this whole situation that has culminated in this hedge fund takeover into context. So it's not a simple story, but it's a very actually exciting story. Bob's going to come back a little bit later. I want to bring Dan in here just for a moment, and we're going to bring the other panelists back. So let me just throw it over to Dan for a minute or two, and we'll move on.
So we've got a double call to action here after listening to Julie and Chuck and Bob. On one hand, to rethink how we support media as a society, and put local journalism on a solid footing for the future. It's clear, as Bob was saying, it's not going to come back on its own. I mean, the model is broken and it ain't coming back. On a more immediate level, remembering the purpose of the occasion, we're asking you, the audience, for your support in telling this story. Please consider donating any amount to help Rick get the film to the finish line. So how you do that? Press the green Support the Film button on your screen to donate through PayPal, credit, or debit card. You can also contribute by check. Instructions are on the stripforpartsfilm.com website. That's stripforpartsfilm.com website. We'll be bringing all the panelists out for more questions in a minute. And if you have questions, please add them to the chat. Thank you.
All right, and we're going to bring everybody back. First, we've got one more film clip for you that we're going to roll right now.
The number one job of a journalist is to hold people in power accountable for the decisions they make.
It's not good enough to say it's going away because that's the way business works. Newspapers are not just any other business. They are the only private industry specifically named in the Bill of Rights.
People need to know there's a problem, and they need to know why it's happening.
History will not judge us kindly. If one day we wake up to realize we failed to protect our community's right to know, and in turn, our very democracy.
And that history Julie talked about there is still unfolding. Last year, Alden Global Capital bought the Tribune Company, which owns some of the nation's oldest, most prestigious newspapers, including the flagship Chicago Tribune. And Alden is using the same playbook, slashing staff. I've read that the paper doesn't even have nighttime staff any longer to monitor the police scanner. That's happening in a city suffering through a prolonged wave of violence and huge public safety concerns. So, Julie, I'm going to go to you first. Where do we stand now with Alden and other hedge fund corporate newspaper takeovers? I'm sure there must be other players aside from Alden too. So what are they and how extensive are their activities?
There are. I mean, the major chains have always, I won't say always, but in the last decade have had private equity ownership in and out, getting bought, sold, transferred back and forth. We have Chatham Asset Management, Apollo. Alden is not the only player. They're the most aggressive one in this business, and both in terms of acquisitions, at least attempted acquisitions, and also in terms of what they're doing to the newsrooms, the level of cutting. It's not to say these other owners are not doing cuts. They are, definitely. But we're at a very critical moment in this history, I think. We have seen where we, the journalists, speaking up and telling our story I have come to learn, was very influential in defeating Alden's takeover attempt of the Gannett chain, and more recently of the Lee Enterprises chain. It didn't work with Tribune, unfortunately, but it is pretty important to see that, just us are telling our own story for the first time, which we've been so reluctant and afraid to do, has actually made a huge difference. I mean, we did stop these guys in their tracks just by writing about the truth. And, I only found out later, hearing from court records and then Rick's work, behind the scenes, finding out that board members on these corporations actually took our work seriously. And I mean, the courage of people like Chuck, I didn't lose my job over this, I left the Herald because I couldn't stand what Alden was doing, but Chuck put his livelihood on the line for this. I mean, the risks that people took when journalists went and protested in New York City, it really raised eyebrows. And I think it's just important for people to know that we don't know which way this is going to go. There's so many good ideas coming up now. Bob's work that research is so remarkable because it informs us about, newspapers have not just been one thing throughout their existence. They have changed transformed, and I think we can keep doing it. We're seeing hybrid models of nonprofit, for profit, but that's not the primary purpose. I mean, all kinds of interesting things are being incubated all over the country in a lot of these same communities right now. In our community, we have our nonprofit, we have other nonprofits. So it's not to say we're all just, the whole country's rolling over and saying, oh, this is just happening. Oh, well, too bad. Bye bye democracy. No, people are coming, working night and day to try to come up with alternatives. And I teach high school kids. I teach bilingual high school kids. They're mainly children of farm workers, and teach journalism. Every summer we do a boot camp. And these kids are so motivated to tell their stories, and they have not been told from their perspective. And they give us so much hope. Journalism is not going away. I want to make sure we are clear on that, but it's because of people fighting back and standing up and doing whatever they can to find a way to tell their stories.
I want to piggyback on that. One of the things that struck me in the 4 years that I've been working on this film is how dedicated so many people are that are in this business. I mean, nobody goes into journalism. Nobody goes into journalism as a reporter or an editor, or to get rich. Maybe newspaper owners, they used to go into it as a way to get rich. But the people who actually do the journalism don't do that. And to me, it translates from the journalists who were experienced that are a large part of this film, but also the younger journalists. And Chuck, I'd like to throw this to you because you're teaching journalism. And one of the things that we did was we filmed you with your students. And these young people are faced with, as I said before, half as many journalists are paid journalists today as were maybe a dozen years ago. Mm. So what are the conversations that you have? What do they say to you faced with maybe not so rosy futures in terms of opportunities? And, what do they say to you, and what do you say to them about this thing called journalism?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a sobering one to be teaching college level journalism students. When I was their age, I had an interest in being a creative writer, and I thought that my career would always be one that I would have to that would be my passion, but I would have to do something else to make money. And it was a calculated decision that I made to pursue that. And one of the ways that I solved the problem, Rick, was that I got into a newsroom and thought that, well, this will be great. I can do journalism and I can make a decent living and support my writing this way. But now my students who are taking journalism, which I should have done back in the day, right, are making the same kind of calculated decision that I was making back then, that they're doing it because they have a passion, because they see the importance of it, because they see the need for it. And even though a lot of them are now learning and facing it already in their lives, that there aren't as many opportunities and it's going to be much more difficult, and we have a much more fragmented newscape in which to navigate, they still want to be a part of this noble profession. They want to make a difference. They want to hold the power accountable. They want to give a voice to the voiceless. They want to be able to tell the kinds of stories that Julie Summer Kids, that program, need to be told. They want to help. And so I know there's the passion, but there is definitely a lot of fear and a lot of nervousness. Used to, not that many years ago, kids, young people in journalism programs, there were a lot of different internships available pretty much every semester and in the summer. And many of them were paid positions so that you could spend a significant amount of time in a newsroom with enough money to get by as a college student, right? And you got real world experience and you got to work with professionals, and you got a leg up on a career. You had opportunities. And it's so hard to find that now. Newsrooms, even the many startups that are trying all these different kinds of experiments, courageously trying these different kinds of experiments to keep newsrooms afloat, and to start newsrooms in different ways. Even though they would like to, they usually don't have the kind of deep pockets that it takes to fund internships. Maybe they can have 1 or 2 interns around unpaid, something like that, but it's not anything like it was only a few years or maybe 10 years ago. And beyond the internship level, it's like we've said, the model of the strong city paper, the strong state level paper, it just appears like it's forever broken. And we've got a much more fragmented media environment. You guys have already talked about the numbers of journalists that we've lost, how tragically it's been decreased. But even in places like Colorado, where the spotlight, because of what happened at the Denver Post, has been so visual and so visceral for a lot of people, that a lot of donations are going to startups like the Colorado Sun, and a lot of donations are going to Colorado Public Radio, and they are boosting their newsrooms and hiring more folks, and they have exciting stories to tell. But it's still a different, fragmented, less funded overall environment from which these kids to land, and it's a concerning thing.
I wanted to jump in here. We have a couple questions from the audience, and this first one, I think both Julie and Chuck have spoken to a little bit, but let me just put this out there. Please speak to the explosion of new newsrooms, many of them local and many of them nonprofit, that are in many ways filling the information gap. While these hedge funds are indeed hollowing out the legacy newsrooms, it seems important to acknowledge the work that these newsrooms are doing. And Julie, I know, Voices of Monterey Bay is like a great example of the kind of effort that this questioner is talking about.
Well, and I want to throw out a caveat here. I mean, I'm very proud of what we've done with Voices. We're telling stories that even when our local newspapers were robust and thriving, didn't do. The stories of marginalized communities, particularly the stories of youth, homeless community, things like that. We have reporters in prison. Just we're much more diverse and creative, and all that is very exciting. That so many new voices are being brought in with these startups. We're part of a large consortium called the Institute for Nonprofit News, which is hundreds of similar publications around the country. But I do want to be a little sober about this and say, we also don't replace the paper of record. I mean, if you look at our budget, it's laughable. We, the 4 co-founders, don't take a salary. We're pure volunteer. We can't, quit our day jobs or stop freelancing or do whatever it is we do. We pay our writers and photographers. We can't be at every meeting. We don't have that kind of staff. So, the paper of record, where you had this robust group of highly trained people who were at every council meeting, at every planning commission meeting, that we are not filling that void. We are performing a huge, important service. But I do want to caution that, by not investing in the news and just letting everybody start a little nonprofit in their little community is not itself going to be the answer. And it may be things that, like what Bob is suggesting, that are more important, is some kind of established fixed subsidy that these organizations could get so that they could compete for it. Their community would elect them, and then they could continue to do their work. But we do need to get back to the concept that we need paid professional journalists, and we need a lot of them if we're going to cover our communities in any meaningful way.
Well, you're reminding me of one essential function of newspapers over the centuries. Really, they're a form, not the absolute only form, but a form of civic memory, and first draft of history. If you want to go back and research the beginnings of PG&E, you want to go to the newspapers where they were advertising and where they were being covered, or Great Western Power Company, whatever. We've got another question here I wanted to throw out to everybody. How do you respond to the critique that the newspapers you're talking about the newspapers of the past, for the most part, did a pretty poor job of covering communities of color, hiring journalists of color, et cetera. So this romanticism is through a very white lens. Anybody want to take that on?
I'd be glad to. Yeah, I mean, and if the point of our exercise was to return to those days, that would be a frightening thought. The plan that I've talked about, for example, the local journalism initiative would have at a minimum 5 well-funded newsrooms in every county. And it'd be multiple voting, so people would get 3 or 4 votes, because you want a lot of different voices. People need a full diet. And in any community that has anything close to a significant minority community, or African American or Latino, would clearly, by the math of that, have ability to have well-funded media by, of, and for their communities, covering their issues for the first time, frankly, in a meaningful way in American history.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a fairly robust ethnic media already in this country, for lack of a better term. I mean, that's, we had New California Media, which became New American Media, which was a consortium of publications from communities of color. And I was involved in some of those programs early on as far as Latino publications. And, we look at that's exactly Voice's mission. We are in a county, in an area that's 60% Latino, but they have not been represented in the local newspapers of record. So there's a lot of bad history to correct. There's no doubt. And that's why I want to emphasize we have the opportunity for a lot of creativity and righting a lot of wrongs here, not just in the business side of journalism, but also in the reporting side as well. And I think, these startups and these hybrids and the creativity going around the country is starting to address that in a very serious way.
I just wanted to add, historically, I think that the questioner is like right on the money. Historically, newspapers have been, in any social issue, have been big players. So, if you go to the days of slavery and the arguments around abolition, you had, these smaller but very, very powerful newspapers, William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, who were writing and very instrumental in the abolitionist movement. And at the same time, you had these other newspapers, daily newspapers in many towns throughout the country. I mean, often in the South, but really throughout the country, that were virulently racist and played the most scandalous roles. Famously in the Tulsa massacre that I think has come to light over the past few years, that took place 100 years ago, the newspapers played a horrible role in perpetuating in taking the side of the of the white racists. So it's a very mixed history, and it's one that also demonstrates that the voices of the media, the news media, whatever you call them, are very powerful and are very instrumental in any sort of public debate, public policy issue.
And one more from the audience, and I think this is aimed this is directed to Bob mostly, but everybody will probably have something to say. If a public entity controls the money for the news, what happens when the newspaper or a media organization is run by the aggressive folks who are currently taking over school boards, state legislatures, and gerrymandering to maintain power? They have been after NPR and PBS for decades. And in Britain, they're about to sell off BBC Channel 4, stripping for parts all over again. Bob, what do you say?
Well, I understand the concern politically. This will be the system that's been laid out would be one in which there be local elections to pick local nonprofit groups based in that community. But there's no ideological or content restrictions otherwise. And if the people in a community elect someone like this, well, that's where the money's going to go. And if people don't like it, they get their own group out and other journalists get together and say, we're going to run in the next election and show how better journalism can be done. I will say this for people definitely concerned about the far right and conspiracy theorists and whack jobs. Behind most of that stuff is someone trying to make a buck. And this would be a pretty rigorous nonprofit standard that would have to pass muster. That will weed out, I think, most of the con artists.
I have one question that I'd like each of the panelists to address is what can the public do? Like maybe one thing from each of you, or what can the public do to address this journalism crisis that we're in?
Well, I'll start. For one thing you can do, if you're interested enough to watch this program, you're clearly interested in the issue, talk about it with your friends if you aren't already. We're at the moment now where we need to just blow on the little bit of flame we've got. We've got to build awareness, momentum, and then start getting our politicians talking about it locally. We have to get everyone engaged and starting and talking with your friends. And that means why this film, get back to it, is so critical. A film like this going around the country, being seen, will provoke discussions like we've just been having. We can sit here and talk for the next 3 hours and have great stuff to say. Anyone, the great thing about journalism, you don't have to be a journalist to talk about it, or a professor. People who are interested in the world are interested in journalism, and everyone's got to take this on as their issue.
That's really well said. I think it's also incumbent upon us, for those of us who really care about democracy in the news, when you see these local experiments doing good work, talk about it beyond just your friends. Also promote it on social media. Also make sure that any circles of influence that you have are also thinking about the journalism that organization is doing. And, at the very least, make sure that you're subscribing or donating to that newsroom so that you're helping it out. The media dollar, I think we have to be mindful of something right now. I mean, it's a golden age of paid TV, right? If you've got the money, you can watch amazing programs, amazing series and documentaries and so forth. But there are so many to choose from. And the money that any household spends on media, a lot of it's going far away from news content. It's going to other kinds of content. And I think you got to remember that your dollars and cents matter to newsrooms, and you got to plan carefully and make sure that folks that are providing good news, who are rising to the levels and the standards of our noble profession and helping communities with their journalism, are getting your support.
You're here.
Well, I echo everything that's just been said by Chuck and Bob. And I will add, also, I would tell the public, you have the right to demand some answers. And that means talking to your elected officials as well. It means talking to the publisher of your local newspaper. Don't just gripe to the reporters. I mean, when I was in the newsroom at the Monterey Herald, I'd hear from everybody what was wrong with the paper and how we weren't covering everything anymore. But the higher ups don't hear it. They're insulated in their boardrooms and their suites and wherever they are, so reach up higher call the publisher, call the head of the chain, find ways to reach out to the people and just keep letting them know the public is watching, the public is interested. I think they take for granted that nobody cares. And at least I work in such a small community. I mean, we are so rural. We have meetings in, like the local Grange, which is out in a big barn. And that's where we talk about, I tell the community that, there's a hedge fund behind this. There are decisions being made on Wall Street that are leading to this lack of coverage. And that's why your high school sporting event didn't get covered last night. Call those people and demand that they start hiring reporters and talk to, especially elected officials. I think it's going to be crucial. There is growing interest among all the way through the federal government to local legislatures, where they are starting to pass resolutions and starting to look at, why is Alden destroying this paper in our community? They're actually specifically looking at the private equity firms that are doing this and trying to call them out. So, we got to keep the pressure up too. Just keep talking and letting the right people know who are in a position to do something about it. I look forward to the day when we have full-on congressional hearings about this issue, because it's so important.
I think we could go on for hours, and maybe we will, but or maybe we'll reschedule for another time. This has been terrific. I really want to thank all the panelists and the moderator for doing this, for coming out. It's just it's an important issue, and to me, it's always a fascinating discussion to have. I also want to thank everybody who's tuned in to this. And if you were inspired by it and have friends that didn't see it, we will have this recorded, and we will let people know how they can see what they missed. And I think that's it. I thank everybody who joined today, and I've said many times, I hope it's not too corny, it takes a village to make a film. So thank you for your support. And I'm just going to toss it over to Dan to wrap up.
Yeah, so as Rick said, thanks to everyone who took the time to join us. Well, journalists can talk for hours about anything. Thanks for bearing with all of our little discursive odysseys here. And just one last reminder that this is a fundraiser for Rick's film Strip for Parts. And I'll remind people how to donate if they want to right now and haven't had a chance to yet. Press the green support the film button on your screen to donate through PayPal, credit, or debit card. You can also contribute by check. Instructions are on the stripforpartsfilm.com website. That's stripforpartsfilm, that's all one word, .com. And that's all we have. Thanks very much for joining us.
Our members are here today to deliver a very simple message to Smith and Freeman. It's time for you to sell this company and get the hell out of the news business. Hey! Hey! All the global's got to go!
The idea of a reporter standing out with a picket sign and lobbying as an activist for a cause is very foreign to us. It took a long time for people to get upset enough.
We believe democracy depends on journalism. Now that you've been exposed, thanks to the dogged investigative reporting of Julie Reynolds, we found out who you really are.
Heath Freeman, come on down! Heath Freeman, come on down!
What Chuck Plunkett unleashed with that section was, I think, permission for journalists to raise their voices, to defend the importance of local news, to explain why journalism matters, and to warn the community that what would be lost would never be replaced.